So as Anna mentioned, I work on broadleaf crop diseases, and sunflowers is one of my favorite ones. And I know sometimes growers get a little uneasy when I say that, but that is because they're a great crop, not because they have a lot of diseases. But they do have a lot of diseases as well. So today I'm going to start with take-home messages here. I'm going to talk about diseases and how common they are in sunflower. And I'm going to share some information from the NSA survey that the National Sunflower Association supports and Anna coordinates. But I want to emphasize that not all diseases are important every year, and even when some occur, they're not economically problematic. We're going to go then to some stem diseases are important. We'll talk about distinguishing them, and I've got some small video clips and lots of images to try to help delineate which ones are important, which ones are not. We'll move into rust, which is very important. We've got great management tools, and then touch on sclerotinia head rot a little bit in the middle of the presentation, but unfortunately that one is tough to manage. Okay, so I'm going to start with the 2025 sunflower survey. I do not want to steal Anna's thunder. She is going to talk about this in an hour or hour and a half or so, but the short version is that this is a survey where people like myself and Anna and others, growers, board members, they go out into fields across the Great Plains and they try to figure out what the most important yield limiting factors are. And Anna's the coordinator. So the thing I'm going to share with you is the number one yield limiting factor. So when the surveyors are out in the fields, and they were in almost 200 fields, I believe, but Anna can correct me, they will identify what they think is the number one limiting factor and the number two limiting factor. And they don't delineate within it necessarily for this image, but just in general, were weeds the most problematic factor, were was drought, was insects, whatever. And so in 2025, clearly diseases were the most important yield limiting factor. There's a lot of diseases around. We saw a lot of diseases this year. And this is consistent across time. So here we're putting up the number one yield limiting factor from 25, 23, 21, and 19. So the survey is done every other year. And you can see that most of the years, diseases are the most problematic yield limiting factor. So let's look at what we saw in 2025. And just for this slide, just keep in your mind that this is the Dakotas plus Minnesota plus Nebraska, Kansas. So there's other states involved, but most of the fields are in North Dakota. Okay, so of what we saw, you can see quite a few different diseases that were problematic. So from the top down, we'll start Phoma, Phomopsis, Sclerotinia, Rhizopus. There's a whole bunch of them. And then rust was not part of the prevalence in the survey, but we've done rust surveys in the past, in the last couple of years, and we know rust was in almost every field we looked at. So we're going to use this as basically the outline for what we're going to cover. And there's a group of diseases here at the bottom that I don't think are that important. We're not going to talk about much. I'll just make a few comments right away. But then we'll go into top down, what are the most common diseases and what do they look like and what can we do about them? So just staying on this slide right away, we'll start from the bottom up. Downy mildew is a major yield limiting problem, but it has not been an issue for some years now. It needs cool and wet springs, which we haven't had a lot of those. We have an excellent seed treatment in oxythiopypryline, so that is labeled as planaris or lumicina. The thing is just rock solid. And then we've got excellent resistance genes in a lot of the hybrids. So we just have not seen much downy mildew recently. We've seen some charcoal rot, not a lot. Those of you that grow soybeans or maybe corn know that charcoal rot can be problematic, and some of those in hot, dry years, particularly hot, dry Augusts. So we saw a little bit in sunflowers. We didn't see too much. My impression is that really we're not taking a yield hit hardly ever from charcoal rot in sunflowers, which is good. Verticillium, those of you that have been in the industry for many years know verticillium can be problematic, but we haven't had much in the recent years. And it infects many different plant species, weeds and crops and things. There's some genetic resistance that's available that's helping us, but overall we see a little bit. Widespread, really not an issue. Okay, the last one I mentioned here is not an issue, is kind of an issue. So Rhizopus head rot is a big problem when you have lots of damage. So hail is a great one, but it needs very high temperatures. So it's rare in North Dakota, Minnesota, Manitoba, but if you're growing sunflowers in Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, you know rhizopus head rot quite well. Unfortunately, there's not much we can do about it, but it is a really high temperature disease and it needs damage in the head. Okay, so for the rest of the talk, we're going to talk about the stem diseases, phoma, phomopsis, and the two sclerotiниas in the stem. And I'm going to add a couple comments about sclerotinia head rot as we go through the sclerotinia side. And then we're going to switch to rust. And that'll be the rest of the presentation. Okay, so let's start with phoma. And the way I'm going to do this is I'll make a few comments right away, and then I'll show you a few images and then move to the next one. Okay, so phoma black stem is very, very common. You could see from the NSA survey data back here, the majority of the fields phoma occurred in. So it's not generally economic. And I get questions about phoma a lot because it's all over the place and it's a big black or a small black lesion, but it looks significant when you have a lot. It's not generally economic. It can be managed with fungicides. We've done some work on that. We know that can occur, but it's generally not necessary. You get these 1 to 2 inch black lesions centered on the petiole. They're just coal black, and you can see the petiole or the leaf axils right there, and that's the lesion or the spores hit the leaf, and then they grow through the petiole into the stem, and that's why you have this centered on the petiole effect. But the pith is intact. It's a very superficial lesion. Now, what's kind of nerve-wracking about phoma sometimes is that you can get 4 or 5 or 6 lesions on every plant in a field. I mean, it is just everywhere. But to emphasize that it's really not economic, I'm showing you a short clip. I'm taking a knife into the field, and you can see that small black lesion on the petiole, and just kind of just scrape off the outer edge of the plant, and everything is tough and healthy. Now, it can cause yield loss in really high yield scenarios, or maybe when an insect is driving that pathogen in, but in general, it's not really a yield concern. Okay, I mentioned you could manage it, and I'm going to show you a resource at the end where you can get information about this. It's usually not worth managing, but we see that R1 applications can be very effective. The SDHIs and the QIs, so think strobilurins, for example, can be pretty effective. Triazoles are a little less effective. So sometimes if you're putting a fungicide down, even if it's not the target, you might get a little nickel and dime benefit against phoma in a really high yield scenario. But it's not something I would definitely target to manage. All right, the next one. Let's talk about phomopsis. So unlike phoma, this is a problem. This has been very economically concerning since maybe 2008, 2009, 2010, and it's pretty widespread in our region. Sorry about the alerts. We have some management tools. We'll get into that a little bit. It needs rain for infection. When you have constant or frequent rainstorms, you have quite a bit of potential for an epidemic. Now, this one produces these large 6 to 8 inch brown lesions. They are not black like phoma. They are just a brown lesion. Again, same process, centered on the petiole because it comes in through the leaf. And unlike phoma, it degrades the pith very quickly. It's a little hard to see on this image, but my thumb there is pressing into that lesion a little bit, and just a little bit of pressure depresses that whole thing. And so when you see this, you'll see a lesion like this that very quickly will result in a lesion like this. You see really high lodging. And we've been in several areas where you have phoma infection, and then you get some high winds, and the field looks like this. And that's pretty devastating. Okay, so managing this. So crop rotation is important, but we really rotate sunflowers quite well. I mean, we are getting benefit by our normal rotation schemes, which is helpful. Resistance. Some hybrids are better than others. I'm not going to call any totally resistant or totally tolerant, but if you're growing sunflowers and you know you have a phomopsis issue, it is important to visit with the people you're working with the seed because they know which hybrids will be better than others. There's been quite a bit of work on fungicides, and we know that fungicides can help, particularly maybe the strobilurins, maybe a little bit the SDHIs. The timing is a little tricky. It's generally around R1, R2, and the reason is we need to protect the leaves. So if you're thinking of a disease that comes in through the leaves, grows through that leaf petiole into the stem and spreads from there, the only way you can really prevent it is to protect the leaves from the initial infection. Once it's in the stem, it's done. The hard part is that if you get frequent rainstorms, you can continually have infection cycles constantly throughout the season. So there's lots of information available about this, and I'll show you a resource we can capture some, but these are kind of a band-aid. They'll help a little bit. Timing is tricky, um, but it's a preventative thing, usually around R1. Okay, the next thing we'll talk about is the sclerotinias, and I'll talk about midstalk and wilt and throw in a little head rot here too. So sclerotinia is a pathogen that infects many, many different crops, and it is economically important. Now, in sunflowers, we worry about head rot the most, unless you're in the high plains. Then you do see some loss from things like wilt. Management is tough. What you get is a white, dry bone colored lesion, and then it'll pretty quickly shred the tissue, and you'll get some of this white, fluffy growth growing on it. This is where it gets its name, white mold. You get these black structures called sclerotia and lodging. So midstalk and head rot begin when you have the little florets fall from the head or stay in the head. The pathogen will infect them and then it'll spread. And I'll show you a couple pictures of that. Whereas wilt begins through the roots. And this is sort of unique in sunflowers. So what happens is, and I'll show you a clip here, what you see is you have a lesion expanding from the ground. And so there's lots of sclerotia in the soil. And as a result, this one tends to show up in rows. So it's not abnormal to see something like this, where you have really significant sclerotinia wilt running right down a row. And that's because the sclerotia are germinating in that row and growing into the plants. Okay, the other way sclerotinia works, which is the normal way, so if you grow another broadleaf crop, you worry about these spores coming out of these little mushrooms. So the mushrooms are called apothecia, they release spores, and the spores will land on flowers, right? So canola, soybeans, dry beans, we talk about an application at early bloom, more or less, right? Well, that's because we need to get these flowers. So this is an image I found in a field where you have this little floret from the sunflower head landed on a leaf, was infected by a spore, and then it started to grow into the leaf tissue itself. And like Phoma and Phomopsis, it grows into the stem and it can move plant to plant. Okay, so towards the end of this lesion life cycle, if you will, you get a lot of white bone material and shredding full of sclerotia, these black things inside the plant. Now, this is the same process for sclerotinia head rot. So you have, instead of landing on a leaf floret, you land on a floret on the head, and pretty soon they're skeletonized and they will break apart and just drop. Okay, unfortunately, sclerotinia management is hard. Crop rotation is important again, but this thing will hit every broadleaf crop and a lot of weeds. That makes it hard. Resistance is improving slowly. There's been a lot of investment in genetic resistance, and it is making a difference, but we're not talking a season or a year. It's decades that take improvement on this one. Fungicides are just as hard, particularly for head rot. There's been over a decade of work that was really, really good work led at the Carrington Research Extension Center by Dr. Michael Bunch. And really, we just don't see consistent, efficacious improvement with any timing or mechanism. This is a hard one. Okay, so let's summarize these here. You got Phoma black stem, small black lesion. You have Phomopsis stem canker, large brown lesion. And then you got mid-stem rot, so this kind of white lesion. And these can occur on the same plant. So here's an unfortunate plant that's got Phomopsis and Phoma on the same stem. And here's a few more unfortunate plants where you have Phoma lesions surrounded by sclerotinia all over the place. And then here's another one where you have Phoma lesions surrounding a Phomopsis lesion. So sunflowers can look a little nasty when you have enough water to get these things going. But the ones we really care about are Phomopsis and sclerotinia. Okay, I'm going to show you another one that's not on the survey, but is potentially important. Bacterial stalk rot has not been an issue. It's really been historically rare, not economic. It needs wounding and water. So if you go dry beans or something like that, you know that well. It's similar, different pathogen, but similar. We saw it in 24 and 25 in multiple locations. And if it was a one or two plant thing, I wouldn't worry about it. But there's a couple fields that went down. And what it does is it degrades the pith and turns it into the soupy goo. And there's little yield if any, if it occurs early. And so what happens is the pathogen gets into the plant and it degrades the pith. It's a pectolytic enzyme that just melts it down and it builds pressure. So take a look at this. So these are healthy looking sunflowers, right? At least from the outside in. But this thing was full of bacteria. And I'll try to play this again here. So look at the pressure building in that stem until it explodes. This is really hard to see in the field unless you're ripping stems open. So what happens is the pith will degrade and it'll turn into this. And it's not till the end of the season that you notice you had bacteria. And unfortunately, it can look like this. So this was a field about an hour from campus, and the field was just massacred by bacteria. These stems looked like this. And we really didn't notice this right until the end of the season. So I'm not trying to scare you with bacteria, but I do think it's important to keep an eye on this one and just be aware. Okay, we're going to spend the last few minutes talking about rust. This is a very important pathogen, and we have very good management tools. So it's a fungal pathogen, and it will cause pretty extreme yield loss when it blows up. We do have excellent management tools. We've got some genetics. We've got really good fungicides. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the fungicides here. This is a pathogen that's specific to sunflower. So many crops have rusts. You know, wheat has 3 different rusts, but they're very specific. So sunflower rust doesn't go to any other crop and vice versa. This is unusual in that it overwinters in North Dakota, which is why we see it so frequently. It needs wetness and warm temperatures, and it can be unpredictable and explosive. So when you see rust, what you generally start to or first observe to see are these small cinnamon brown pustules with dusty spores. This is how I will often first see it. So this is a leaf that was flat facing the sky, and dew formed in this little depression. And you have this little raging epidemic right in this depression, which is really interesting. And that's simply because it had longer wet periods. It had dew that would pool in there and create this perfect environment for a rust epidemic. Now, as it progresses, it will just start to dry out the plant. And it can occur pretty much in any green area of the plant. What happens is it really dries it out and robs the yield. So over the last couple of years, a graduate student of mine, Zach Ittle at NDSU, has been leading some rust studies. I'm going to talk just a little bit about it. There's a lot of cooperators here, and I really appreciate everyone that's been helpful. Zach is the one holding the camera, and Dennis is the one working with him next to him. The first thing these guys did is they went across North Dakota and the Great Plains. I'm just showing you North Dakota in the last couple of years and looking at fields for rust. And what they found was rust was everywhere. So you can see the field numbers here by year. So North Dakota had 43 fields and 41 of them had rust. South Dakota, they visited 8 and 8 had rust, and so on. Very similar in 2024. And what they found in the Northern Great Plains was that 122 of 124 fields had rust. Now they were looking for rust. Sometimes they'd go to a shelter belt or a very favorable area, but it emphasizes that it's out there, and in the right environment, it can blow up quickly. Okay, so management. So one of the things that's sort of unique about sunflowers is there's so many wilds everywhere. Well, wilds are notorious for harboring rust. A few other things too, but rust primarily. Destroying wilds will make a difference. Destroying volunteers will make a difference. Hybrid selection is important. Confections are generally more sensitive than oils, and there's resistance genes around that are very good, but there are a lot of pathogen races. So hybrids, I think selection of a good hybrid is really important, but it cannot replace the need for scouting. The scouting is critical here, and if you have rust show up at the right time, a fungicide application will help. Okay, so the right time. Well, this is how we look at rust, and we're looking on the upper leaf severity, upper leaves. So at R1, R5, I'd look at the top 4 fully expanded. And what we recommend is that somewhere about 1% severity at R5, you probably want to pull the trigger on a fungicide application. But I would emphasize that we've seen multiple cases now in the last few years where even 0.1% at R5 is enough to cause an economic loss if it explodes through R5 and R6. So just to give you a real example, this is about 1% severity. Okay, again, 1% severity and maybe even less, upper 4 fully expanded leaves at or before R5. Rust doesn't occur every year in every field. Many times it doesn't occur at all on the upper leaves. So scouting is critical. Okay, so Zach and team put together some fungicide trials. So this is a confectionery hybrid, and we are looking at severity at R6, R7 in 2 years combined, 2 years combined. So on this bar, on the vertical bar, you're looking at the average rust severity. So you can see here it goes from 0 to 14%. Okay, 14% is enormous disease pressure, and that's at R6, R7. On the bottom bar, you're looking at the treatments. So all the treatments were made at R5, generally R5.2, as much as we could get that timing. And you have a non-treated control, and then you've got 5 different products, a little bit newer ones, older generics, that sort of thing. It's a nice mix. Now at R5, when these products were sprayed, the rust severity was less than 1%. That one application prevented the rust explosion that we see. So onset, Quadris, Luna, Prax, or Headline, they all worked. Non-treated control was 13%. It's enormous. Okay, that's this big, and I'll move faster, Anna. I see you. Okay, so what did they do to yield? Well, there was a major effect. And so this yield is just from the 2025 trial, but you can see the non-treated is great trial, 2,600 pounds. The highest treatment here is over 3,500. Actually, 4 of them were over 3,500. Rust robbed 1,000 pounds of yield, and a single fungicide application prevented it. Okay, take-home messages again. We've got diseases. They're not all important. Distinguish the stem diseases. That helps management in the future. Boy, scout for rust. Head rot's a monster. Not much we can do. I'm just going to share one resource with you. There's a sunflower working group that worked with the NSA to build the website for diseases. You can see I'm highlighting 18 different diseases here. And it's a pretty slick system because then we upload all the fungicide work and things that we do for the year into this. So I would encourage you to visit that if you have more information. You've seen this before. It's a great resource for diagnostics. And thank you for all your help. Thank you, Anna and Jeff, for organizing this and everyone that contributed. I really appreciate it.